Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this last lecture in our 2022 ADHD Resource Fair. I'm Pam Barton, Chapter Coordinator for CHAD of Northern Virginia and DC. Tonight's lecture, It's Complicated When ADHD Comes with Anxiety, will be presented tonight by Dr. Rebecca Resnick, Dr. Christine Rosenthal, and Dr. Rachel Singer from Rebecca Resnick and Associates. Our chapter, one of the many chapters throughout the United States, aligns with CHAD National's mission of improving the lives of those affected with ADHD. We are a volunteer organization of trained professionals who offer support in a number of ways. In addition to hosting this annual ADHD Resource Fair, we offer a free monthly lecture series on the second Tuesday evenings of most months, and we have support groups for parents and adults. At this time, we would like to thank our gold and silver sponsors for this year's resource fair, which is now I have to shift things here. And wait a second. Hold on just a second. Now I'm having technical difficulties here. And yes. Okay. There we go. Our gold sponsors this year have been Bass Educational Services, the Chesapeake Center, and the Ross Center. Bass Educational Services is a full-service educational consulting group dedicated to the premise that learning differently should not be a barrier to academic success. Services include K-12 school placement, ACT, SAT, test prep, subject tutoring, ADHD and EF coaching, educational advising, as well as college, post-secondary, and gap year planning. The Chesapeake Center has dedicated 35 plus years to treating those with ADHD, learning differences, and the many coexisting conditions across the lifespan. Their mission is to help people with attention, learning, and behavioral challenges learn how to lead successful, satisfying lives. They offer comprehensive treatment with individualized care. The Ross Center has been delivering a full spectrum of sophisticated psychiatric and psychological services that result in meaningful change for individuals and families for over 30 years. They offer comprehensive ADHD testing for families and adults, as well as therapeutic and psychiatric services. And we want to thank quickly our silver sponsors for their generous support: Illuminos Academic Coaching and Tutoring, Integrated Psychology Associates of McLean, LLC, Learning RX, Pathfinder Coaching and Tutoring, LLC, and the Siena School. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our speakers for this evening. Dr. Rebecca Resnick is a licensed psychologist and a founder of Rebecca Resnick and Associates, a group practice with 2 offices in North Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. Resnick specializes in neuropsychological assessments of children and teens with learning and attentional difficulties, autism, and mood concerns. Dr. Resnick is the 2022-2023 president of the Maryland Psychological Association. Her book, A Family's First Guide to ADHD, was published in 2016. Dr. Rachel Singer is a clinical director at Resnick and Associates. She's a licensed psychologist who specialize in providing evidence-based clinical interventions for children, adolescents, adults, and families. Dr. Singer was awarded the American Psychological Association's Citizen Psychologist Award for her outreach work with immigrant, refugee, and asylee communities. Dr. Christine Rosenthal is a licensed psychologist and a director at Resnick and Associates, and specializes in the treatment of anxiety, depression, OCD, and trauma in teens and adults. Dr. Rosenthal has been an integral part of expanding the educational advocacy branch of Resnick and Associates, and also serves on the board of the Trauma Resilience Understanding and Education Center in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Dr. Resnick, Dr. Singer, and Dr. Rosenthal for presenting this very valuable information to our ADHD community tonight.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us here today. We are very excited. As she said, I'm Dr. Rosenthal from Resnick and Associates. We specialize in doing therapy and assessment, and we also really love community outreach. So we're very excited to get to be here today to participate in this program presented by Chad. And so today I'm going to start, I'm going to pull up the screen for us to see. We are talking with you guys about anxiety and OCD, right? So we have, it's complicated. I'm sorry, ADHD and anxiety, right? So it's complicated when ADHD comes with anxiety. And so just to get a start, I'm just going to give here just a rundown of our talking points for today. So today we're going to just start with having just a basic overview of what are some symptoms of ADHD and anxiety, and I will present that part. And then Dr. Resnick will be talking about the hypothesized noted high comorbidity between ADHD and anxiety. And then Dr. Singer will finish us out with some practical application, right? So what are some strategies for helping teens, adolescents, or children more effectively manage co-occurring symptoms of ADHD and anxiety? And as it says here at the bottom, this is solely for educational purposes. And so we are happy to answer general questions that come up. However, we ask that you hold any more specific questions. You're welcome to contact us more directly if you have any questions, but please keep your questions more general about situations as compared to more specific ones for your specific child. And so to get started, pardon me?
If you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, and then we'll have a longer time for additional questions. So if we don't get to your questions kind of during the presentation, we'll definitely make time to answer it at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Singer. And so for us to get started, I will be starting with anxiety. One second, let me just, there we go. So to get started, what is anxiety? And so I was wondering, just for you guys to take a step back and just think about, when you hear the word anxiety, what are some words or images that come to mind? And so I invite you, if you feel up to it, just to kind of drop that like right in the chat. What are some words or thoughts or images that come to mind when you think about anxiety? A second just to drop that in the chat. Let's see what we have. Overwhelmed, worry. Yes, yes. Anything else people think of? Heart racing, right? The like physical part. Absolutely. These are great. Anything else? Uncertainty. Yeah. How do we sit with uncertainty? Insomnia, perseverating, fear about the future, a sense of doom, dread, irritability, out of control. Perfectionism. Ooh, yes. Anxiety definitely leads to that spiraling. Yes. These are good. It's like you guys are like experts in it already. Worst case scenario, right? That kind of gets like to the thoughts, the catastrophizing. Absolutely. These are great. These are great. And so worrying about the stuff that hasn't happened yet. Yeah. Since you guys are kind of getting right here at the core of anxiety, and just the different parts of it. Sorry, one second. It is. One second, let me just advance this. There we go. So when we think about anxiety, exactly as you guys hit at, there's like 4 basic parts I love to think about when talking about anxiety. And so we have the emotions that go with it, the physiology, right? Or like what happens like in the body. Someone mentioned the heart racing. The cognitions are the thoughts, and the behaviors, and they're all kind of connected. And so I'm going to just kind of walk us quickly through each one, which you guys all already kind of were getting at so well. So one is the physiology. As someone said, the heart is racing, right? And so this is where your whole body, right? The like nervous system is activated into the fight or flight space, right? So we're ready for action, right? There's perceived danger. And so it could be, especially if there's an uncertainty kind of like looming, right? We're kind of worried about the future, as some people mentioned. We notice the heart, the muscle tension. Some folks get the stomach ache, like headaches, backaches. We're sweating a lot, kind of dizzy. Breathing is kind of slow or sometimes it kind of can like speed up and it's kind of shallow. It's like, And right, so when our body's in that state, of course, we're kind of panicked. And as we got at too, it's hard to sleep, right? With all those like racing thoughts. And kind of why I have the image of the fire alarm here is anxiety. When folks have really high anxiety, it kind of creates a really hypersensitive fire alarm system like in their body, right? And so it kind of takes like not so much to make the alarm go off and to think that there's like something dangerous happening. As a quick example, when I was in college, I was in this brand new dorm, which is great. At the same time, the fire alarms were super sensitive. And so they went off at the slightest hint of anything, such as dust, which was a problem because the dorm was still under construction. So that alarm was going off a lot, like at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Very effective alarm, but kind of what needed to be like recalibrated, right? To go off like when it needed to, and not just in more innocuous situations. So kind of when we're thinking about anxiety, we're trying to help folks like recalibrate that alarm system. Another component of anxiety, right? So we talked about physiology or the other emotions that come along with anxiety, right? So some you might imagine fear, right? If I was standing in that photo, right, with that person looking down, and so I think that's a river, I would be horrified. I have seen this photo a number of times, and each time I see it, right, the heart's going, I feel fear. And it's hard for me to kind of think about anything positive. I'm imagining if I was standing there, it'd be hard to think about upcoming fun things happening, right? There's anger, irritability. And somebody, I believe, talked about or mentioned in the chat that with anxiety, right, we're kind of just like spiraling, right? We're kind of just like in that panic state, and also more irritable too, right? It's hard to focus or to be more positively engaged with other people when we're kind of worrying about the worst thing that could happen. And so then this ties us to 3, the thoughts, which a lot of you guys mentioned, right? Focusing in on the negative, like what's the worst possible outcome, right? So for somebody who has anxiety, right? So if there's a situation of uncertainty, which is a breeding ground for anxiety, we kind of imagine like the worst, right? So if there's a test coming up and we're not sure how we're going to do, we're start catastrophizing, imagining the worst outcome, right? And so there's also tunnel vision. We just focus on the negative, and it's hard just to settle like into the present moment. And so I'll also say, as I'm kind of going through these things right here, I want you just to kind of start thinking about how some of this might kind of overlap or interplay with ADHD, just kind of starting to think about some of the possible interconnections that kind of might be happening. And so now if we imagine, right, somebody, right, we're in a situation and their heart's beating really, really quickly with something new kind of coming up. We also notice, kind of going back to the last past slide about the emotions, if they're feeling kind of fearful and if their thoughts are racing and they're frightening, sometimes we kind of get examples like this, right? It goes from I fail a test to very quickly escalates, right, to I'm going to fail class, I'm going to fail the grade, fail my life, and it's going to be over, right? And so it just quickly goes to it's going to be the worst thing like ever, right? And so just imagine, right, kind of going through life like that, right, where our schema, right, our outlook on the world is like, it's hard to feel hopeful, right? And so that is where we see anxiety just growing and growing and growing, is where it's hard to just take a challenging situation and be able to approach it in a more adaptive way. And so kind of then what we see are some really common behaviors with anxiety. A quote I love is, avoidance and anxiety are our teammates, right? And so understandably, right, like nobody likes to feel uncomfortable in a situation. And so it makes sense then that we avoid situations that bring on fear, right? And so as it says in the first bullet point, right, with more of anxiety, there's more avoidance, and then it kind of decreases the chance of being able to learn from situations, right? So we kind of get rid of our opportunity to kind of see, hey, I can actually handle a challenging situation, right? And so instead we kind of see when someone has a lot of anxiety, it's just increasing the need for control, right? So more irritability, wanting to make sure situations are exactly as expected, right? So kind of goes back to, as it gets at the bottom, increased preference for familiarity, for a repetition, right? So having it be the exact same. So even like think about some of your own kiddos or people you know who are anxious, right? If they are expecting the day to go one certain way and for it to follow, right? Every morning we have breakfast at this time, and then mom takes me to school and X, Y, and Z happens. Let's say you try and like introduce something different where you say, hey, actually, like this person's going to take you to school today, and actually there's a new person who's going to be teaching your class today because your normal teacher's out. For most kiddos, or for most people, like, okay, like we can kind of think, okay, like that's a new change I wasn't really expecting, but I'm sure like it'll be okay. It'll all work out. For someone who has more anxiety, it kind of goes into panic mode of like, well, like with all the uncertainty, right? Who's like, how's this teacher gonna be? Are they gonna be kind? Am I gonna get to school on time? Like with this new person taking me to school. And so we kind of want that control and the familiarity happening. And so kind of to give us a nice example, right, of how we might see this play out, right? So if anyone here has watched Schitt's Creek before, it's about a family who was very wealthy, and then they got placed in a town, in a small town. And one of the characters' names is David, and David can have a lot of stress and anxiety. And so I thought we could watch this and kind of see in summary, like what anxiety looks like. And you'll see in the clip as well, his sister, Alexis, is also there. And you can kind of see kind of the like juxtaposition between David, who in this scene thinks he's having a heart attack, and he's trying to tell Alexis how come he thinks he's having a heart attack. And so as you're watching, kind of notice some of the different things that we talked about. And so I'm going to make sure my audio is fully turned up.
Can you get a heart murmur from a lack of sleep? Because I have not slept since we've got here, and I think my body is shutting down.
Well, I hate to admit it, but I actually know very little about heart murmurs.
Well, I have one. The pulse is very irregular.
Honestly, David, I have tried to find my pulse like 1,000 times and nothing. So
No,
don't
this
worry
is very
about it.
serious. My heart has not rested in a long time. My immune system is very low. I have not been able to find Kale anywhere here.
How long are we going to be talking about you for?
I think I'm having a heart attack is what's
David?
happening.
You are like 34.
I'm basically 29.
Oh my God, you are overreacting.
I think you're going to feel very guilty when I slip into a coma and you have to come visit me in the hospital at hospice.
Well, I'm going to go for a jog, so don't die until I get back.
Well, how long are you going for?
I don't really know. How long are you going to be like this for?
Don't be a little...
And so I'll pause it there for us, right? And so if we just kind of think about David, right? We can kind of see everything we were just talking about here with anxiety, right? And so I never met David in person, so I can't diagnose him. What we do see is kind of some of exactly what we talked about. And so some of the anxiety disorders I'm going to run or talk about are some ones that can be comorbid with ADHD, and some that David showed a little bit of from the clip, right? So with David, we saw, right, he thought he was dying. He thought because he couldn't feel his heart murmur, he's having a heart attack. And you saw his voice was really just like he was talking super quickly. Heart was probably racing, right? And so just a lot of anxiety, right? And Alexis is just kind of like listening and just like, David, I think it's okay, right? So it's just an example of anxiety. And so kind of looking here at the different anxiety disorders, like someone talk about generalized anxiety and social anxiety. Generalized anxiety really is characterized by uncontrollable worries, right? So it's just folks who just have a lot of intrusive thoughts about many different things. For a lot of adolescents and teens, this tends to be about school, because school is your job at that point, right? And so might notice they're kind of irritable, difficulty sleeping if their thoughts are kind of racing, trouble focusing, right? Which again, thinking about ADHD, there's some parallel there, right? Restless, like on edge, kind of just like the jitters, and just sometimes like the muscle tension, right? And so Social anxiety is anxiety, however, it's more so focused in the social situation as it gets at. And so this is really where in social situations, whenever we're there, we feel super anxious, really worried about making mistakes or having our anxiety be noticed, often avoid situations that are social. If they're invited and they're there, like I said, there's a lot of stress while they're there. And so now we've taken a look at anxiety. What I want to do now is take a look at ADHD. What is ADHD? And I know if you've looked at the CHAD website, you're probably very well versed in it. And though what I want to do is something a little bit different. So instead of talking about what is ADHD, I wanted to talk about what is it not? So what are some common misconceptions, right, with ADHD, right? So one of the big ones is that it's just caused by an unstructured environment, right? So this kid can't focus in school or complete their homework on time because the teacher is it's just not organized. They have no expectations. So it's just the environment. Or what a bad parent. They don't have any structure at home. So it's just caused by a poor environment, right? So in all actuality, from a lot of research, ADHD, there are a lot of neurological differences that we notice in the brains of folks who have ADHD, right? Which is why it's a neuro developmental disorder, right? And so some of the big areas that we see are changes in the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, striatal lobe, the parietal lobe and the limbic regions, right? And so I'll get more into that a little bit later. Just have to know those are there are actual structural changes, right? And so some of the spaces where we see change is there's decreased gray matter. What does that mean? Really, there is less matter in the gray matter is the part that's in charge of processing information and initiating action. There's also increased white matter. That really just means this region is responsible for coordinating communication between the different brain regions. So there's a excess of that. And then we also kind of see just in general immaturity in the development of the brain. And so in this article I read, which this paper is from, it talks about there are actually the morphological differences that they found predicted the diagnosis of ADHD correctly in 83% of cases. And so this actually fits with the heritability of ADHD being between about 77 to 88%, which is very high. If we think about, I think I read the heritability of some anxiety disorders might be just around 30%. So it's a lot lower. So it is really, there's a really high genetic component. Another misconception is that it's just an excuse for being lazy or careless, right? The kids they just don't want to do their work. They just want to just rush through and rather just watch video games and not do their work, or the room's just super messy, or they just have a lot of energy. It's a lot of blame, right, on the kid, right? And so yes, there is some abnormality to rather watching a fun video clip than doing your homework at the same time, right? For folks with ADHD, what we do see is there are associated changes in different brain circuits. And so I won't go into the specifics, but as you see here with the SLF, the superior longitudinal and fasciculus, we do see these regions are responsible for really important parts of functioning, specifically executive functioning, right? So being able to attend to the different sounds in the environment and parse out what actually is important for me to be listening to, right? Is that the teacher's voice, right? In the classroom, or noticing what I need to spatially be listening, attending to, right? So being able to parse out all the background stuff happening and focus in with language articulation and regulation regulation of language and processing again, right? So all of the regulation parts, and really want to highlight too, just kind of noticing the cortico-limbic neurological pathway, right, which hits on the amygdala, thalamus, orbital frontal cortex. Really, really, really important because it gets at the emotion regulation, which we do see being difficult for folks with ADHD. And a big part is motivation, right? So a lot of people talk about my child just procrastinates, just doesn't like want to do the work. There's like a neurological reason for that. And so just finally, we do see sometimes folks say it's mainly in kids or in boys. And so talking about actually adults do have ADHD, that 65% of adults who had it when they were younger, they still do see symptoms. However, they tend to be less in severity, especially with the hyperactivity. Also, we see, looking at the second bullet point, typically girls tend to present the more inattentive features of ADHD. So sometimes those get missed or misdiagnosed as anxiety sometimes. So looking at the second one, sometimes anxiety might be placed as the primary disorder, which might really mask the fact that there is ADHD, right? So maybe the girl is really stressed about school because the ADHD symptoms are making it harder for her to perform to the level that she knows she can, right? So then it kind of masks the ADHD. And then lastly, we see in terms of race, there tends to be underdiagnosis in African American or Latino populations, which can sometimes lead to overdiagnosis in some of the conduct disorders, which then can lead also to like under medication or incorrect medication in traditionally marginalized groups. And so for the final part then, I'm just going to talk quickly about the about our diagnoses and symptoms. So I'm sure you're familiar with these, right? So there's two types of ADHD. We have predominantly inattentive, and then the predominantly hyperactive impulsive. And so we need at least 6 or more for folks 16 or younger, and 5 or more for 17 and up. And so the combined presentation is where you kind of can meet criteria for both. And then finally, just kind of talking about the connection here as we're leading into now thinking about putting it all together. We think about generalized anxiety and ADHD, you know, just as we kind of were going through the diagnoses and the symptoms for both, a big overlap we do see is just, again, the physicality, right? So it kind of presents a lot in the body, right? That's that like keyed up feeling, the talking quickly kind of when we're really anxious or just really excited about something, the trouble concentrating, careless mistakes when it's hard to focus, or when we're really anxious can be hard to make a mistake, or it's hard to focus and notice mistakes. We kind of talked about the brain regions kind of at play in that for folks with ADHD, and just like sensory overload. Some clients I've talked about with ADHD and anxiety, being in a really stimulating environment can make things kind of worse and kind of increase the emotional dysregulation feeling. And kind of with social anxiety and ADHD, I've been thinking more about this, and I just have noticed some clients talk about who have ADHD. It can be, they notice that in social situations, sometimes they talk too much, and sometimes their peers are kind of frustrated with that. So they tend to hold back more. And so something just to kind of put out there to kind of think about too, just those areas of overlap that we might see there, and kind of pause and get curious about. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Resnick to talk more about the connection between anxiety and ADHD.
Thanks, Dr. Rosenthal. It's great. I've never gotten to see you speak before. All right. So hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca, she, her pronouns. So yeah, I'm going to give you like a super quick crash course on kind of the neuroscience of ADHD, because from my point of view, if you understand a little bit about what's going on underneath the hood, then you are in a much better position to advocate for your child, communicate with your child, understand kind of the why behind some of these symptoms that we see, and teach a child. So again, this connection between ADHD and anxiety it is a big deal because for kids with ADHD, there's about a 50% co-occurrence rate with some kind of mood disorder, and anxiety seems to be the big one at different times in our lives. The other thing to know about anxiety is that the longer you experience chronic stress, you have physiologic changes in both how your brain and your body work that can put you at much higher risk over time for actually having a depression. And even worse, like mixed anxiety and depression and ADHD all at once is kind of a perfect storm of awful things that hits a lot of our kids during the teenage years. So this is preventable, of course. One thing I want to draw your attention to, of course, is that in our Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM, this was created way back when, not quite yet. Our behavioral criteria for ADHD was created before we really understood much about how the brain works. Now, our understanding of how the brain works is still very much in its infancy, but we've made a lot of rapid progress over the last, say, 20 years. But our diagnostic criteria are still very much based on behaviors that I can see, particularly behaviors that a teacher might be able to see. Now, having been a teacher, I know that it's really hard to monitor what's going on with 30 kids all at the same time, particularly when you're talking about symptoms like distractibility or daydreaming or losing focus. The kid who was running around the room, like my oldest son, no problem. They get diagnosed really quick. The kids who are like my younger son, who just sort of slowly fade in and out of focus and maybe are thinking about Lord of the Rings or Doctor Who, these kids slide right under the radar. And particularly our girls, our kids of color, our bilingual students, our immigrant populations, a lot of these kids, because they're not showing things that smack people upside the head with, look at this behavior, notice it, a lot of times these kids don't get identified. And so I want to give you, again, a little bit of an understanding of what ADHD is actually like from a brain perspective. Okay, Dr. Rosenthal, I'm ready. So the first thing to think about when we think about the human brain is, what is it designed to do? Your brain is really not for thinking. Your brain is designed to keep you alive long enough so that you can reproduce, pass on your genes. So brains are programmed to pay attention to things that are very salient. Basically, there's questions that the brain is trying to answer. Can I eat it? Will it eat me? Can I mate with it? Does it want to mate with me? Or is it some kind of danger? And we all come from a long line of ancestors who were really good at paying attention to the right things. The ancestor that paid attention when a snake got too near her baby. The ancestor who saw another person in the village getting really angry and decided, okay, this is a good time not to say anything else. The person who, was particularly charming and managed to get married and pass on their genes. All of our ancestors got both anxious and focused on the right stuff. And if they didn't survive to pass on their genes. So we come from a long line of the really good ones. Okay, right, next slide. So in deciding where to spend resources and sort of how to function in the world, we have two competing systems in our body. And one system is the system that gets us super jazzed up, super aroused, and super excited. And that is the sympathetic nervous system, as indicated there by the kitty who is very unhappy on one side of the screen. The other system that we have is the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, this is the one that shuts us down. Nature designed us to err on the side of Netflix and chill, especially if you're almost 50 like I am. You want to conserve resources when you're in a situation, as most of us were for all throughout human history, where there really wasn't enough to eat. If you had enough to eat, 200 years ago, you were one of the very rare lucky people. So a brain's very expensive, a body's very expensive. And so our whole system is designed not to waste a lot of resources getting overexcited about stuff. So our body developed this really cool system between body and brain. It's a feedback system, and it's called the allostatic system. Basically, what this means is that our bodies and brains are really good at setting budgets. Remember, if there's not enough to go around, if you haven't had enough to eat, if you didn't get enough resources out of the environment, you have to be very stingy. You have to budget your resources. And allostasis basically means that our hypothalamus deep in the brain, our pituitary gland, and our adrenal glands, which are the ones that shoot out adrenaline that gets us all super excited. This system tries to figure out, should the sympathetic nervous system be turned on, or should we turn on the sympathetic nervous or the parasympathetic nervous system so that we can do really important things like go to sleep at night. When this allostatic load gets out of whack and we're getting too excited or too agitated in the wrong circumstances, then we run into problems. So you want to have your sympathetic nervous system turned on if, say, you're driving your car and all of a sudden a deer jumps right out in front of you. Yes, that is when the sympathetic nervous system needs to be operating on full blast. But for a lot of our people, our kids and people, when they're anxious, that sympathetic nervous system is starting to kick up right at the time when we're trying to go to sleep, when we need that parasympathetic nervous system to be shutting the body down so that we can go through all that important brain cleaning and information consolidation that we need during sleeping time. So what I want you to think about in terms of anxiety here is all about the context. Are you jazzed up as you should be? Are you agitated or afraid as you should be, given what's happening around you? And it's that mismatch is where we run into a situation that's not just stress, but it's an anxiety disorder. Okay. Now, attention is a lot like a spotlight. This is sort of a metaphor that Michael Posner, one of the great researchers of the human attention system, came up with. Now, if you think about what a spotlight does, a spotlight focuses your attention on one particular most salient thing. So, for example, if you go to see Hamilton and the spotlight is on Lin-Manuel Miranda, that's not an accident. That's because he's the most important thing to pay attention to at that particular moment. The trick with ADHD is that our kids are having trouble shining their spotlight and keeping it focused on the most important thing at the moment. It's really important when you have a spotlight on something that the house lights in the theater not be up at the same time, because successful attention is not just about focusing, it's also about ignoring. For particularly with our neurodiverse kids, our kids who have autism on the autism spectrum disorder, whichever language you happen to prefer, our kids with autism have a really hard time processing sensory information. And so for them, shining that spotlight and keeping it focused on what the neurotypicals in the world think they should be focusing on is really hard and can actually be extremely stressful and uncomfortable. Posner talked about how our attention system has three major tasks. The first is alerting. And that means we actually have to get the system activated to pay attention to the right thing at the right moment. You all probably noticed that maybe your kids or maybe your husband or maybe you might have trouble with the alerting system. So for me, if my husband's working in front of the computer, I need to say about 5 different times, honey, it's time for dinner. Honey, it's time for dinner. Honey, it's time for dinner. And you can see basically he hears me, but his attention system has not activated. That alerting function hasn't come on. And he says, yeah, honey, be there in a sec. And he keeps right on working. Those of you who are parents know what I mean. Then there's the orienting phase. For some of our kids, their attention system gets alerted and they're sort of looking around for, what do I pay attention to? This is maybe when the teacher says, okay, everybody, it's now time for math. Get out your textbook. I want you to turn to page 18. We're going to do numbers 1 through 10 odd. Whoa, okay. If it took your alerting system a little while to come online, and then it took your orienting system a little while to figure out where you need to shine your spotlight, by the time your teacher's starting the math lesson, you're already behind. Spotlighting refers to attentional control. And with ADHD, we all know it is not that you can't pay attention. Our kids with ADHD can do their favorite thing, which is often something very stimulating like playing video games. They can do that for hours. The house could burn down around them and they would still be trying to get to the next level or kill that guy who's coming around the corner. Spotlighting is really important because you need to be able to keep your attention focused on the most important thing for as long as it takes until you finish a task. And so our kids with ADHD have trouble with start, stop, and finish. In the words of Dr. Sam Goldstein, editor of the Journal of Attention Disorders, they can get their attention focused on something, but then an internal distraction or an external distraction knocks that spotlight off of where it needs to be. One of the biggest culprits for internal distractibility, for knocking that spotlight off of where it needs to be, is anxiety, that sense of dread, rumination, overwhelm, all those things you all put in the chat. So attention is about balancing optimal levels of what we call phasic attention. That is just sort of paying attention. Like right now, you're paying attention. Your phasic attention system is activated. But if you all of a sudden heard the baby start to cry, or the smoke alarm went off like Christine was talking about, or your dog starts flipping out at the front door and it sounds like maybe somebody's, trying to steal your Amazon package, this is when tonic attention would activate. And tonic is those short bursts of, whoa, I got to pay attention to that. So for our kids, a lot of times that natural system that we have that regulates whether we're on sort of phasic attention versus tonic attention isn't activating at the right time, or it isn't activating as long as it needs to in order to get a job done. Okay, Dr. Rosenthal? Thank you. Now, the important thing to know about the brain is that it really has very limited bandwidth. And if you remember the days of limited bandwidth, trying to say, download a really complicated picture or have multiple tabs open, or try to do 2 different things on the computer at one time meant that your whole computer crashed. Brains really have a lot less ability to donate, some popped up cookies here. Hello, Cookie. Brains actually have very limited capacity to focus on any one thing at a time. Now, our brains fool us. We think that we're paying attention to the road and where we're going and what our kids are doing in the back seat, and we're changing the movie, the movie DVD, and maybe we're picking up the sippy cup, all these things. Maybe we're talking to our husband or our spouse on the phone. We think we're paying attention to a whole bunch of stuff at once, but we're actually not. Our brain is fooling us. We're not paying attention to a whole bunch of things. We're actually giving short little bursts of attention to a whole bunch of different things. Shift, 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 shift. That's tiring. So energy and bandwidth, very limited resources. Now, if you have a kiddo where their alerting, orienting, and spotlighting system is not doing what it needs to do for their age, for their context, the situation that they're in, bring in some anxiety and you make the problem 3 times worse, because anxiety is a bandwidth hog. Nature designed us to pay attention to threats. Nature made us have a brain that whenever there was any kind of danger in the environment, we would stop doing whatever it is we were doing and pay attention to the danger. And unfortunately, in our modern complicated high-tech world, our kids are bombarded with things that overwhelm their attention system and provoke a lot of anxiety. We were never really designed to function in an environment like this. And you often hear a lot of people sort of trashing like, oh, Gen Z, they're just so lazy, they're so anxious, they're so weak. Well, really, this isn't Gen Z's fault, because nobody in Gen Z designed an iPhone or a PlayStation or an Xbox or any of the other apps that our kids, Gen Z designed TikTok, okay? That was all of us older people. So if you want to know who to blame for these kids now coming up having attention problems, that would be us. Okay, next slide. Like I said, brains have very limited bandwidth. And when your alerting, orienting, and spotlighting system is overwhelmed, when you are not shining your spotlight and keeping it focused on where it needs to be, you find that doing any kind of complex multi-step task becomes overwhelming. When we think about our kids in classrooms, usually they start to have real problems in 3rd grade. Now, why is that? 3rd grade is when the cognitive load for almost every task they have to do increases greatly. So our 1st and 2nd graders, typically they're maybe having trouble sitting still, but most of the work that they need to do can be completed really pretty quickly. And we still give them a lot of movement breaks and sensory experiences. But in 3rd grade, you're hitting that reading to learn time, you're hitting multi-step algorithms, writing paragraphs and book reports, and you're talking about being expected. You really need to sit and keep your attentional spotlight focused on something for a long period of time. So the cognitive load often exceeds what our kids with ADHD can do. And it often becomes extremely overwhelming to try to do something with a heavy cognitive load like writing when you've got not only your distractibility, but anxiety hogging all the bandwidth. Okay, next slide, please. So we have an epic battle for attention resources. Remember, they're scarce. We have literally a fight in our brain. Not only do we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems fighting with each other for which system is going to be most active at the time, we have, as Dr. Rosenthal mentioned, a whole bunch of brain areas, and each brain area has its own little task and its own circuits that it's connected up with all these other brain areas. And all of these areas are competing for the attention of the prefrontal cortex, this sort of command center that decides what are we going to pay attention to? What are we going to shine our attentional spotlight on? Now, you can think of anxiety disorders as when the limbic circuits, the amygdaloid circuit, locus coeruleus, all the things under the frontal lobe that regulate our levels of arousal, emotion, our threat detection system, our pleasure detection system. These things basically start screaming at the prefrontal cortex. There's danger around. Oh my gosh, pay attention to this. And the prefrontal cortex can go along for the ride. So sustained stress, numerous adverse effects. It's not only your brain, it's your body. People who are under a lot of stress don't sleep well. Their sleep cycles are disturbed. And when your sleep cycles are disturbed, you are grumpy and you don't learn very well. You tend to have more behavior problems. You have trouble motivating yourself. You get frustrated. All these things that teachers complain about as if the kid is deciding to do this. This is their physiology. And the problem is, of course, the more we're trying to cope with what we perceive as a lot of feeling overwhelmed all the time, we tend to adapt. We tend to get into some behaviors that really kind of make the problem worse. Like, for example, as Dr. Rosenthal talked about, we start avoiding things that are very stressful, but we can also start trying to control everything. And these anxious kids are the ones who, like, they cannot be flexible. They cannot go with the flow. They have to control everything. They have to push back. They have to negotiate. So we've got our avoiders and we've got our approachers. All of this is really a recipe for disaster when you're talking about trying to get through the level of work in the later level of elementary school, middle school, high school, college, and wherever else you want to go. Next slide, please. This is just a little map for you to understand that we have brain systems that are always competing. And we have the central executive network, lower right. This is the part of our brain that is actively solving problems. So when your third grader or your high schooler sits down to write an extended constructed response in biology class, this is the part of the brain that is focusing that spotlight, pulling up information out of working memory and trying to get the job done. But your salience network up at the top, this is the network that will hijack that central executive and say, whoa, there's something that really, really, really we have to pay attention to. It's either dangerous or good to eat or really rewarding or really miserable. Let's pay attention to this. And when you're daydreaming and when you're really not consciously thinking about doing anything, the default network is on. Now, there's nothing wrong with our default network. Our brain really needs to take time out and cycle through consolidating information and filing stuff away. This is a good thing. Daydreaming is not actually just a bad thing. It's a feature, not a bug. But the thing to pay attention to with our ADHD kids is that their default network, that sort of daydreamy consolidation, ruminating part of the brain, can't be on at the same time as the central executive. So when you have a kid who is just sort of daydreaming or mindlessly ruminating or stressing, that means that their central executive, the problem-solving circuits, are off. Okay. So beating a dead horse here, we have parts of our brain that are trying to figure out what to focus on. That's the prefrontal cortex. And then we have all these other parts of the brain that are saying, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. We want to eat, we want to play, we want to move, we want to have sex, we want to do all the things that brains want to do. And then it's the job of the prefrontal cortex to say, not now, put a lid on that, maybe later. And so that's how we get through our day. And our emotional learning system, this system that is always trying to get the prefrontal cortex attention, is very plastic. This means that it changes a lot. As kids grow, their brain is actually programming itself all the time. When you say that teachers rewire the brain, it's not a metaphor, it is literally the truth. Parents too, we wire our kids' brains and they wire ours too. So the problem is, of course, as kids go through their day and they learn through experiences that things are stressful, that they're not going to go well, that they're going to get bullied, that they're maybe going to fail a test, that their teacher is going to complain constantly. Why don't you sit down? Why don't you focus? Why didn't you finish? Where is your homework? We can develop a real phobia of school very easily when we're exposed to this day after day after day after day. And for kids with ADHD, the messages that they're hearing, particularly if they're hyperactive, are overwhelmingly negative. And is it any surprise that they stop liking school? I think we can all understand that. Again, this is not a character flaw. This is their physiology, and this is their trying to make their very best adaptation to a system that wasn't well designed for them. Okay, Christine. So with anxiety, what tends to happen is that kids who are anxious get very sensitized. And so over time, you tend to get more anxious. Once you start worrying about something, it kind of takes over your brain and your brain starts to give it a lot of bandwidth. So think for a second about if you went out to the park and a huge hornet landed on your arm. We've all had that experience. And it's terrifying and you freeze, right? Your very first response is, oh my gosh, I hope it doesn't sting me. That's what we call the entry gradient. And so for our kids without anxiety, they get super agitated. Their sympathetic nervous system kicks in, all their glucocorticoid stress hormones start flowing. They're very stressed about this hornet. But as soon as the hornet flies away, our kids who don't have anxiety disorders, you can see, go down to baseline calm again. For our kids with anxiety disorders, not just anxiety, but an anxiety disorder, they stay upregulated. They stay super hypersensitive to any sign that there could be another hornet around or what would have happened if I got stung. And then you set off this cognitive emotional cycle where the anxiety kind of catches like a wildfire. Next slide, please. Almost done. Okay, so emotion steers our thinking. We are emotional beings. There's no human being in the world and could never be a person who is purely rational. Our emotions are what keep us alive. They allow us to learn. And the point I wanted to bring home here is, then why I have a picture of Simone Biles is, if you remember at the last Olympics, when Simone went to compete, all of the trauma of having been abused by her coaches for years and abused by Larry Nassar really hit her as soon as she got into the competition, and it started to interfere with her focus. So that anxiety, that stress, that trauma threw her off her game. This is, arguably the best gymnast the world has ever known, somebody who's done vaults day in, day out since she was a little tiny girl. She has ADHD, by the way. And all of a sudden, her anxiety was taking up the bandwidth that she needed to be able to do her fantastic jumps. And she got what they call the twisties. And so anxiety sucked up all her bandwidth. It knocked her attentional spotlight off kilter. And as we know, on a day when she was supposed to win a whole bunch of medals, she had to bow out and let other people take the limelight. So the glitch is that reactions must be proportional to what's actually happening in the moment. So for Simone Biles, her body and her brain were reacting as if she was still being abused by all those people who were supposed to be taking care of her. And now that she needed to focus on gymnastics, she couldn't do it. This happens a lot for our kids. Their brains get completely overwhelmed. Their bandwidth gets hijacked by anxiety. Their brain and their body are in this feedback loop, and it's causing their reactions to be way out of context. Okay, one more slide. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to the best part. Nothing wrong with you, Dr. Rosenthal, but I think everyone's like, okay, oh my gosh, now we know all this stuff about anxiety. Who can calm us down? And that would be Dr. Singer.
All right, here we are. Happy Tuesday. Is it Tuesday? Yes, it's Tuesday. It's so nice to be here with you all. I'm Dr. Rachel Singer. Thank you for taking time out of your evening to be here I could hang out with you all for much longer than we actually have time for, so I'm going to keep my eye on the time. Bear in mind, we're giving you a broad brushstrokes overview of what is anxiety, what is ADHD, what are some of the strategies. We're not going to be able to answer all questions tonight, but we look forward to answering some of your general questions in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we talked about, anxiety and ADHD, they are friends, they are interrelated, and one may go undiagnosed, right? So if you're anxious and you're having a hard time paying attention, people may assume it's just due to your anxiety. Or if you are struggling in class, you may also be stressed about it. And let's be real, anxiety is not all bad. If you have a test coming up and you're feeling some anxiety about it, it can help you to focus. It's a check engine light that comes on and it reminds you to pay attention. Let's do things a little bit differently. Next slide, please. When we are anxious, it impacts our ability to think, plan, reason. All of those things become impaired. So you will never find me skydiving, but let's say instead of this talk tonight, we all decided to jump out of an airplane together. And just as we jump out, some jerk from the plane shouts out a math question at us. What's 12 times 15? Now, you're probably starting to calculate this. Oh, I know the answer to that. I actually have to remember my math to do this. But as we are plummeting to the earth, it's going to be a lot harder for us to do that regular mathematical computation that you could probably do while your feet are firmly planted on the ground. When we're anxious, it's harder to concentrate. And when we can't concentrate, that amps up our stress. Next slide, please. So emotions are a wave. And Christine, you're going to get to push the button a lot of times because there's some animations on the slide. So go ahead and advance. It has a start point, it has a peak, and it has an end point. And so when you're feeling anxious, you may notice you start to get stressed. There's a point where things are really, really hard and overwhelming, and then it comes down naturally on its own. Now, next slide, please. Sometimes what happens when we're really overwhelmed or stressed, one back, is we just want to get out of the situation. This is too hard, this is too much. If you're sitting with a kid who's got ADHD and anxiety and they're doing homework, they're like, I don't want to do this, I can't do this. I have some really smart kiddos in my family, but when we sit down to do math, or my kiddos are small, so we're reading a book out loud, the book goes flying across the room. This is too hard, I don't want to stick it out. We lose the opportunity to see ourselves ride out this discomfort. So you may notice a lot of avoidance for folks with ADHD and anxiety. Next slide, please. This is not an actual photo of my closet, but pretty darn close. My favorite strategy when I have guests coming over is to take all the things and shove them in the closet and close the door. I have literally had a boot fall from a very high height. I'm like pretty short, and hit me on the head because I had tried to clean up this way. When we avoid things, it often increases our discomfort. We're kicking the can down the road. So clients with ADHD who may have emotions that are much closer to the surface, they may feel more overwhelmed, they may have a stronger emotional reaction, and potentially less insight about what's happening internally. Next slide, please. So we get to nerd out a little bit tonight. We're talking about evidence-based interventions. All that means is that there is a strong research foundation that indicates these particular approaches are likely to be helpful. Note that there is no one-size-fits-all strategy. Not every strategy works for every person. But again, we want some evidence-based ones that will save us time rather than having to kind of hunt around for different tools. Next slide, please. So one of the great strategies, and again, this is one of those animation slides, so I'm going to ask you to advance. We're looking at our CBT triangle. We're looking at the connection between our thoughts, you can go ahead and our feelings, and also our actions. And we're going to be focusing on the thought-based strategies and the action-based strategies tonight. I don't know anyone who can stop having a feeling. So if you're feeling anxious or stressed about a task and someone says, don't worry about it, has that advice ever worked for a single person on this call? That has never helped me. or you're sad about something and someone says, cheer up. I don't know any strategies for erasing an emotion, but we're going to think about some of the thought and the action-based strategies. Knowing what Dr. Rosenthal and Dr. Resnick have said about that kind of frontal lobe, the thinking, planning, organizing part of the brain, we may also need some action-based strategies that allow the front part of our brain to communicate effectively with the back part of our brain. So I'm going to introduce you to one such strategy. And you can go ahead and pop to the next one. The stop, breathe, think is a way of combining a couple of things. It's pausing, which allows the brain to communicate a little bit more effectively. We stop, we pause, we look at what I'm doing. This can be a cue to kind of look around. Okay, I am currently doodling on my paper. All of my friends have their math workbooks open to page 18. Am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing right now in this moment? Or I'm in a meeting and everyone else appears to be talking to their neighbor and I'm lost in thought. Should this be the chance that I have to kind of network or connect? We pause. And one of the ways that we can pause is through our breath. So I'm going to give you all a chance to breathe with this next slide coming up here. When we breathe, diaphragmatic breathing is going to cue that rest and digest response. The parasympathetic neural response, the part of our neural response that says everything is okay, the danger has passed. When we breathe slow, deep inhales and slow, deep exhales, we are able to turn off that panic, fight or flight system and turn on the relaxation response. So give yourself just a moment here. I know you guys are all experts at breathing. Let's try to breathe in a slightly different way for just one breath together. We're going to breathe in through our nose, inhale for 3 seconds. And then when you exhale, make your mouth an O shape and breathe out like you're breathing out through a straw. We're going to try to exhale for 5 seconds. And if you are, I'm a flutist, if you play clarinet or flute or wind instrument, go for 6, why not? So let's start by exhaling all the air in our lungs. Just breathe it all out. Big inhale through your nose all the way in. And exhale. Okay, y'all, I think I need to practice a little more flute. I could only make it to 5 seconds. When we stop and we breathe, again, we're allowing our stress level to come down a little bit. We're shortening the duration of that fight or flight panic response. We're also maybe reducing the intensity of our emotions. We're allowing ourselves to focus and center a little bit. And that allows us to connect on this next slide with our thoughts. And when we're thinking, there's going to be a couple of other thought strategies I'll walk through with each of you. But this first thought strategy is, okay, looking at my actions. What am I currently doing? And is this a good idea or a bad idea? Right? So I have a client who will say, or a parent who will say, I often notice one of my children just walking up to my other child and smacking them on the back of the head. Just out of the blue. I don't understand it, why. It's a terrible idea. So starting to help our children and our teens internalize a little bit of this moral compass and to think, okay, what I'm about to do, is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Do I have an alternative? To look at what are my current actions and what should I be doing instead? All right, let's flip to the next slide. And we're going to think a little bit about some of those cognitive strategies, the thought-based tools. We're going to start by identifying what is it that we're feeling anxious about. So if you have a child or a teen who is anxious, they're stressed, they're overwhelmed, they're having trouble focusing, we can start by asking them some questions. What is it you're most stressed about? We have plenty of clients who come through our doors who are engaging in some school refusal. I don't want to go. Let's find out why. What is it about it? Is it the workload? Is it the people? Is it feeling self-conscious? Is it you are exhausted, you're overwhelmed? What is it you're feeling really overwhelmed about right now? When we identify some of those stressful thoughts, we can also practice changing them. I'm going to fail my test tomorrow. Is there any other way to think about this? This is a hard test, but this is not going to end you. You are an amazing, resilient person. I have seen you take hard tests before and you've come through on the other side. You know, oftentimes, and I fall into this trap too, as a parent of some wonderful anxious kids, I want to rescue them. I want to protect them. I want to tell my kids that they are safe, that everything is going to be fine. I'm going to tell you to try the opposite, which I know is hard. It's really hard for me to do. Instead of saying that scary thing will never happen, follow that thought through for a second. What's the worst case scenario? You're worried you might fail? What would happen if you failed? Really, what would actually happen? Would you get kicked out of school? Are they going to tell you you have to leave Maryland or Virginia or you can never come back? No, you'll probably be pretty bummed for a week, and then you'll meet with your teacher. You'll figure out a way to do some makeup work. Maybe you'll do some extra credit, and we'll figure out some study strategies that help you better next time. How would we actually deal with this problem? Oftentimes that takes the stress level down a little bit. It may help your wonderfully inattentive ADHD kiddos, students, to think, how do I plan for this situation? Are there strategies that I can use that maybe are a little bit more effective than my kind of panic and flee? We can flip to the next slide here. We can also talk about some behavioral or action-based strategies. Thinking about where your child, where your student is now, and where you would like them to be. Now, maybe right now you are doing everything for them. You are packing their lunch, you are putting their clothes out, you are reviewing their homework load with them. You're doing all of that, and you'd like them to be more independent. Or maybe they're feeling anxious about presenting in front of class because once they get up there, they lose the thread of what they were trying to say and it just feels too much. So we're going to create a little bit of a ladder. Where are you right now and where are you getting to? Where do you want to get towards? We want you to be able to pack your bag independently. We want you to be able to present in front of the class. We're going to face this challenge in small steps, piece by piece. We're going to start with smaller challenges and work our way towards that harder one. So rather than packing the bag entirely by yourself, let's make a list together of everything you need. Day 1, I'm going to walk you through this checklist. Day 2, I'm going to give you a whiteboard marker and you're going to check these things off by yourself. And I'm going to talk to you at the end. Day 3, let's see if you can pack your bag independently. It may take a little bit more than 3 days to establish that independence. But the idea is we are increasing their independent use of strategies and we are gradually and sort of thoughtfully, carefully fading out our support. I promise you will not be obsolete. They will still always need you and love you and want you, but we want them to be using these strategies more on their own. Next slide, please. There are some wonderful mindfulness-based tools that are being used really effectively as some great preventative strategies in schools where there are high rates of ADHD, where there are high rates of kids who've experienced significant trauma. Mindfulness helps us focus on what's happening right now at a slightly lower level of stress. I'm just keeping my eye on my time here. So if we're using mindfulness, I'm going to encourage you to try a brief experiment. And you can look at this picture on the screen if you want, or if there's something more interesting in the room around you, pick one object just for a moment and look at it in a little bit more of an in-depth way. If you were going to describe this object to a very artistic friend of yours who is sitting in another room, they can't see it, but you can. How would you describe this object? What colors would your friend need to use on their palette in order to paint it? Is the object reflecting light or is it emitting light, making its own light? Does it look shiny or smooth? Allowing yourself to shift your head a little bit and notice how the object changes as you look at it. The idea behind this mindfulness grounding is that temporarily, briefly, just for a moment, we are allowing ourselves to focus in a very kind of intense, concerted way on a neutral stimulus. I was looking at my lamp. My lamp has never done anything to hurt me before. It's not a particularly beautiful lamp or a horrible one. It's just there. So if your child is feeling overwhelmed or their thoughts are racing or they can't sit still, having them focus on something that they can see, on a physical sensation, on their breath, something that helps them kind of reorient to the present moment, gets them out of those racing thoughts and that anxious thought spiral. Next slide, please. All right, we can talk about any of these strategies for another 90 minutes, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of resources that I really, really love. A couple of these on the left side of the screen over here, What to Do When You Worry Too Much. This is a nice workbook for our younger elementary school age kiddos, built on some CBT principles here. I really love Ellie Leibowitz's Treating Childhood and Adolescent Anxiety. This is a guide for you. It's strategies for you as a parent to help manage these symptoms. And then the Smart But Scattered series, again, practical, parent-oriented tools. We really particularly love these books because they tend to cover a lot of ground. They're evidence-based and they're very useful. I just want to point out that while I love these books, I don't get any financial kickback for recommending them to you. So you don't have to buy them in order, to show your support for us today. But I do like these, again, because of the evidence-based foundation and that they are geared for parents and families to use on their own. So now we are going to shift to a little bit more of an interactive portion of our evening. We have some common questions that we get asked a lot, but we're also very happy to open it up to questions that you might have. And I'm trying to remember from our wonderful hosts if folks should write their questions in the chat box or unmute. I know we've got 72 participants, so are we preferring that people will type their responses?
Yes, that'd probably be best.
That would be awesome. If you have questions, you've got the three of us. We are a captive audience. General questions that other folks may benefit from. And if you're feeling a little shy today, we do also have some frequently asked questions that we often get asked. So Dr. Rosenthal, while people are percolating, should we maybe touch on some of the common questions that we get asked? And then
If
we
you
can
guys,
always...
times to definitely drop your questions in the chat. And so, as Dr. Singer said, here's just some questions that we tend to see. Some common questions just to kind of get the conversation going. And so I do see I think there's a new question in the okay, comment. Thank you. So some questions. I'm sorry, for some reason, my computer is being finicky about advancing to the next slide. So bear with me for a second. There we go. So one common question is, and so I'll just kind of present this and then we as the co-presenters can kind of maybe talk about how we might think about this. So one is, my child has difficulty concentrating. How can I tell if this is due to anxiety or to ADHD? Yeah. So one way I kind of think about this is first kind of think about like the other symptoms, or just think about like when they're working on schoolwork. I'm trying to see, are there times when it's easier or harder, let's say, for them to focus on it. And so like if it's test taking, if it's really hard for them to focus during something like that, but at times where there's like less pressure, or if they're just like doing some homework, then I might think, okay, this might be a little bit more of the anxiety realm, because it means that they can focus on like difficult tasks that require a lot of mental effort, but there might be some pressure from the environment. When it comes to ADHD, I'm really a fan of also just kind of noticing other areas for concentrating. So kind of going back to the diagnosis and kind of looking at ability to organize their work, to start their work, and kind of see if, increased structure kind of helps them kind of better concentrate and having those firmer deadlines. I also, though, think sometimes a really good assessment sometimes can really help out and kind of get like under the hood, as Dr. Resnick said. But that's something I often think about. Do any of you guys, Dr. Singer or Dr. Resnick, have any thoughts on how you kind of handle that question?
The
So-
first question somebody asked in the chat actually dovetails nicely with this.
Yeah.
What's the best way for ADHD adults to help manage ADHD in anxious children? Really hard modeling when you have the same issues going on. I think a lot of us as parents get that. So do you two want to dovetail that into what you were saying before? So she gets her question answered, because I think her question can be woven into this. That's all right.
Sure. Let me just look at that. The best way for ADHD adults to help manage ADHD in anxious children. Mhm.
So the nice thing with looking at a symptom, rather than just looking at a label, it's nice to have a label because then we have got a community, we can kind of destigmatize it. This is normal, lots of other folks have it. But if you have a symptom, there may be a strategy that you can use to kind of treat that. And it may not necessarily matter what it is. So like if you have an itchy spot on your arm and you put hydrocortisone cream on it, it doesn't matter if it's a spider bite or mosquito bite as long as it goes away. But if you're having an allergic reaction, you do really need to know what was it that I ate that I'm allergic to. When we're thinking about kind of assessing for anxiety, I'm looking at the first question we've got here. We could use extra help. What kind of specialist is best to see? You can start by talking to your pediatrician or primary care doctor. They may have some assessments that they can use, like the Vanderbilt, which can help you with diagnosing, is this ADHD? Is this something else? Is the inattentiveness or challenges with kind of focusing, is it related to a particular stressor in the environment? We can also contact school counselors who may have some resources there. Typically for ADHD, the gold standard is cognitive behavioral therapy as a starting point. Medication management can help to reduce the symptoms of anxiety enough that the strategies are more effective. We get lots of questions about medication with ADHD. It is a tool, it's a resource, just like my glasses help me see, but they don't make me a better driver. I need them to go about my day, but I'm the one who's kind of doing the work. I'm seeing that there's a question in the chat about ADHD adults to help manage ADHD symptoms with ADHD children. It's hard when we have some of the same issues going on.
I was thinking about that when just thinking as like a parent, I think sometimes it could be helpful just to recognize that might be like what's going on for you. Like, oh, I think I have ADHD, right? If you're sure about that. And then what's cool about modeling, about being a parent, is that you can directly teach something to your child, even just sometimes calling it out to them. Sometimes I have a hard time focusing or I have a hard time like getting started on a task that I really like don't want to do. And I think sometimes the best way could kind of have a transparent conversation like with your child, and kind of talk about some strategies that you find helpful, whether it be like having a calendar for yourself, or like setting alarms in your phone, right? Or having like reinforcement like for yourself, right? After you do something positive, or after you do like a really hard task, or breaking a big task into smaller ones. So a really good way to help to manage it could kind of be transparent, kind of share like what helps you, and then kind of like brainstorm like with them which of these strategies like might help like with you too. Because you're right, it is hard to model when you struggle the same way. And sometimes the beauty of parenting is that your kids like look up to you, right? And so when you can be transparent, sometimes that's encouraging for them to see like my guardians, my adults in my life also struggle, and they also have found ways to help themselves, and they're not perfect at it, and yet they're still trying. So being a team, I think, could be really helpful with that. That's a great question.
And we may use, we see a wide range of clients, different ages at our practice. We'll sometimes say we use the same strategies for our clients who are 6 as our clients who are 60. We frame it differently, we explain it differently, but the underlying fundamental tool is the same. Exposure to a stressful situation helps your brain recalibrate and feel a little bit braver when you face it the next time. So there's also some other cool research that's long-term research. Adults who were diagnosed with ADHD when they were kids when they have some good early interventions, the executive, functioning kind of specific tools that help them target and regulate their behavior, their symptoms may reduce over time. So if you have that insight, you can say, here are the strategies that worked for me. Now you and I are different people. Let's explore, let's figure out if the same strategies work for you or if we need to find a different one. A lot of the parents I work with, when we're teaching strategies for managing inattention and anxiety, will often say, I struggle with this too, and I'm practicing that strategy at home and it's also helping me. So meeting with a professional, you may get some tools for helping your child or teen manage their behavior, and you may get some kind of family-oriented strategies as well.
Absolutely.
Ladies, we have 2 more questions and they kind of dovetail on each other. One is about screen time for anxious kids with ADHD, and the other is kind of the flip side of that, is about the evidence base of exercise. So those seem to me to be 2 sides of the same coin. I'll let you take it.
I was smiling when I saw the screen time. I feel like most of the parents I talk to, no matter what who the kid is or what they're working on, that's a big one, right? Because we are in a very technological, like a technology heavy environment. And so my thing is, there really aren't many things that are inherently bad in and of itself. So I wouldn't say screen time is an inherently bad thing. So it becomes a matter of how we use it. And so there is, one, thinking about what are mindful ways to use screen time, right? And so of course it's monitoring what your child is watching and how long they're on it. And so my typical recommendations I think about with ADHD and anxiety and for grade school kids with screen time is, 1, being aware of what they're watching, and then 2, being aware of how long they're watching for. And so typically we talk about having, doing our homework and then having some screen time after. So of course it's kind of the pre-MAC principle, right? So doing the thing you don't really want to do first, and then the reward after. Sometimes with ADHD, once we're on something we like, it can be hard to shift gears. So sometimes having the homework and then the screen time. In terms of how much, there's varied research. Some folks say 2 hours, some people say half an hour. I would say things become a problem when it gets in the way of life, of homework, of sleep, of social time. So it's hard to give us a set number, but those are just general guidelines. And for anxiety, a lot of times with social media, that's a big thing, is again, kind of monitoring what they're watching, just in seeing how it kind of speaks to their view of themselves and other people in the world. So I would say for anxiety, more so watching, checking in on social media and being mindful of that, and just having those open, honest conversations about that. Let's see. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Singer, or the question on physical activity?
A lot of the families I work with will say the screen time isn't the problem, it's shutting the screen off that's the problem.
Yeah.
So for both kids with ADHD, or for individuals with ADHD and anxiety, transitions are hard. And just transitions are hard for all of us, but it can be especially hard. So setting very clear expectations ahead of time. I'm going to set this timer, and when the timer goes off, that's the time for today. I will give you a cue when it's almost time to shut it down as much as you can. For the exercise question, we love exercise for helping manage the symptoms of anxiety and for also kind of helping with attentional focus. There's great research that exercise can help break down kind of cortisol, the stress chemical in the brain. It cues the brain, we have run from the tiger, we are safe. So even just kind of some jumping jacks or going for a run, part of that may be helping the timing. I have some clients with anxiety who will run so much, they're so exhausted, they can't concentrate. So figuring out what's the right balance for you. Some of my clients with ADHD diagnoses are the star of their soccer team, their off-road bike teams. So building on their strengths, helping them feel confident in those abilities, and then also saying, we have to balance this wonderful activity with maybe some things you don't want to do, having a little bit of that distress tolerance. Okay, we do need to shut the screen off, we do need to get some work done. Your chores are still waiting for you. So thinking about kind of how and when to integrate screen time and exercise can be a good conversation to have as a family.
Mhm. And
I'll
then,
chime in a little bit there since I'm on my third teenager now. So Dr. Rosenthal and Dr. Singer have younger kids than I do, but I am there with you in the trenches where, you know, my stepson is now 30. And when he was coming up, you know, there were video games, and he had a flip phone. And if he wanted to text, he had to push a button 3 times to select any one letter. Nobody was sexting. You know, I did not have to worry about him getting pictures of people's body parts or sending things like that. And unfortunately for Gen Z, they are growing up in a world that has basically all of the inappropriate, violent, sexual contact, pornographic content of the world, like on tap with a fire hose all the time. If I could give any recommendations, it would be, please do not get your child a cell phone until they are 13 years old. I know that everyone's like, what? But all the 5th graders have them. That doesn't mean it's a good thing. You know, we've been convinced that we should buy our children these things when actually buying young kids cell phones is very harmful to their mood, very harmful to their academic success, their self-concept, you name it, it messes with it. And it also tends to suck up so much time that they're not engaging in physical activity. And you know, the more kids are exercising, the better their mood, the better their focus, the more they're on tech. You know, again, tech's fine. There's nothing wrong with tech, but it tends to force all the good stuff out of life. So I needed to vent.
yes, that is a good soapbox. We have just a few minutes left. I saw though, there was a question about medication from the same person. So if somebody was taking Adderall as a teenager but doesn't want to take it now, and they wanted to start taking Strattera, would this medication also lessen anxiety? And then with that also, is it better to pursue mindfulness and yoga than medication for anxiety?
There are different classes of medication that can kind of help to manage symptoms of ADHD and anxiety. Often the common class of medication to manage ADHD are stimulants. And then the most common class of medication to manage anxiety are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, like Prozac, for example. There can be interactions between different medications, but in general, stimulants and SSRIs are pretty well studied. We can't give specific recommendations for folks. Really want to encourage you to talk to your primary care doctors and your psychiatrists. But just to note that any medication is not a perfect fix. You're looking for something that reduces your symptoms enough that your strategies are accessible, and you're looking for a medication where the benefit of taking it outweighs any side effects or negative effects. If you're saying the side effects are a really big problem, I'm not seeing any benefit, talk to your prescribing provider and they can kind of help you manage that as well. And then mindfulness, yoga, breathing, there are so many good strategies. Find the ones that help you and help your family. You can experiment with this. You can say, let's try this. If you feel better afterwards, then it's a good one for you. The best strategies are free. You can do them on your own. They're portable. They don't involve a lot of heavy equipment. So if your strategy only involves your goldfish Rex who lives in your house, you're not bringing your goldfish with you to school. So you want to have strategies that you can use across lots of different environments. Breathing is a good one because you can do it anywhere. It's free. It doesn't involve any equipment. Same thing with mindfulness and meditation.
These are so many good questions. I'm noticing the time, and so we wanted to provide you guys with our contact information. If you have any follow-up questions, we'd be happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you to Nova Chad for the opportunity to speak here tonight about the intersection with anxiety and ADHD. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Resnick, Dr. Singer, and Dr. Rosenthal for this incredible lecture. It's so much information, so much needed information for our ADHD community. So we really appreciate you taking the time to share this with everyone.
Welcome.
Mhm.